The morning sun was just starting to peek over the rolling hills of Northern California when Maria stepped out of her small cottage. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the sweet smell of ripe grapes ready for harvest. October was always her favorite time at the vineyard. After 3 years of working the grape harvest, she had grown to love these early morning moments before the day got busy. Her 8-year-old son Danny was still getting dressed inside their tiny worker's cottage. The boy was excited about today because his mom had promised he could help pick grapes for the first time. School was on break for harvest week, and Danny had been begging his mother for months to let him work alongside her in the vineyard. Maria pulled her long dark hair back into a ponytail and checked her watch. It was barely 6 in the morning, but she liked to get to the vineyard early. The work was hard, and the California sun could get brutal by afternoon. Getting an early start meant she could finish her section before the heat became unbearable. The cottage where Maria and Danny lived was small but comfortable. It sat at the edge of the Riverside Vineyard property, about a quarter mile from the main house where the owners lived. Maria had been lucky to get this job 3 years ago. The pay was decent, and having a place to live on the property meant she could save money and be close to her work. Danny came running out of the cottage, his sneakers barely tied and his hair sticking up in all directions. At 8 years old, he was full of energy and curiosity about everything around him. He loved living at the vineyard, even though it could get lonely with no other kids around. "Mom, can I really help pick grapes today?" Danny asked, bouncing on his toes with excitement. Maria smiled and ruffled his messy hair. "Yes, but you have to listen to everything I tell you. The vineyard can be dangerous if you're not careful. There are holes in the ground and some of the equipment is heavy." Danny nodded seriously. He had been around the vineyard long enough to know that his mom was always careful about safety. She had taught him to stay away from the big machines and never to wander off alone. Maria grabbed her work gloves and the small lunch she had packed the night before. She always brought extra food because the work made her hungry, and she never knew how long the day would be. The vineyard owners were fair people, but harvest time was stressful for everyone. They needed to get all the grapes picked at just the right time. The morning was so quiet that Maria could hear birds singing in the oak trees that dotted the property. In a few hours, the vineyard would be buzzing with activity. Workers would be spread across the rows of grapevines, carefully picking the fruit that would eventually become wine. But right now it felt like she and Danny were the only people awake for miles. "Are we going to see Tom this morning?" Danny asked as they walked toward the main vineyard area. Tom was the vineyard supervisor, a kind older man who had been working with grapes for over 20 years. He always had time to answer Danny's questions about how grapes grew and what made good wine. Maria was grateful that Tom was patient with her son's endless curiosity. "I'm sure we'll see him," Maria said. "He's usually the first person here in the morning. He likes to check on everything before the other workers arrive." They walked along the dirt path that connected the worker cottages to the main vineyard. Maria had walked this path hundreds of times, but she never got tired of the view. Rolling hills covered in neat rows of grapevines stretched as far as she could see. In the distance, she could make out the main house where the vineyard owners lived. The Riverside Vineyard had been in the same family for over 50 years. The current owners had inherited it from their parents and were working hard to keep the business going. Maria knew that running a vineyard was expensive and risky. Bad weather, diseases, or problems with the harvest could ruin an entire year's work. As they got closer to the vineyard, Danny started asking his usual morning questions. He wanted to know why some grapes were ready to pick and others weren't, why the workers had to start so early, and whether he would get to taste the wine that came from the grapes he helped pick. Maria answered his questions patiently, enjoying their quiet conversation. These morning walks with her son were some of her favorite times. During the day, she was busy working, and Danny was usually playing by himself or reading books. But in these early morning moments, they could just be together and talk. The sun was getting higher in the sky, casting long shadows between the rows of grapevines. Maria could see that the grapes in today's section were perfectly ripe. They had that deep purple color that meant they were ready to be picked. If they waited too long, the grapes would get overripe and wouldn't make good wine. "Stay close to me today," Maria reminded Danny as they reached the edge of the vineyard. "I know you're excited, but I need you to listen and be careful." Danny promised he would stay right beside his mother. He had been looking forward to this day for weeks, and he didn't want to do anything that would get him in trouble or make his mom worry. Maria looked at her watch again. It was almost 6:30, and she expected to see Tom's truck parked near the equipment shed. But as they walked closer to the main work area, she noticed that things seemed quieter than usual. There were no other workers around yet, which wasn't unusual, but she couldn't see Tom's truck either. The vineyard felt different that morning, though Maria couldn't put her finger on what was wrong. Maybe it was just because Danny was with her for the first time, or maybe she was nervous about letting him help with the harvest work. She had been working at the vineyard for 3 years without any problems, and the owners trusted her to do her job well. Danny was chattering excitedly about all the things he wanted to learn about grape picking. He wanted to know how to tell which grapes were the best ones to pick, how heavy the baskets would be, and whether he would be strong enough to carry them. Maria smiled at her son's enthusiasm. She remembered being his age and being curious about everything around her. Growing up, she had moved around a lot, and she was happy that Danny could have a stable home at the vineyard. Even though their cottage was small, it was theirs, and Danny had made friends with some of the other workers' children who visited during harvest season. As they walked deeper into the vineyard, Maria felt a strange feeling in her stomach. Something didn't feel right, but she couldn't figure out what it was. The morning was beautiful, her son was happy, and she was looking forward to a good day of work. Maybe she was just nervous about having Danny help for the first time. The grapes hung heavy on the vines, ready to be picked and turned into wine. Maria had learned a lot about grapes and winemaking during her time at the vineyard. She knew that the work she did was important, and she took pride in doing it well. The vineyard owners had always treated her fairly, and she hoped to continue working there for many years to come. Danny ran ahead a few steps, then came back to walk beside his mother. He was too excited to walk slowly, but he remembered his promise to stay close. This was going to be the best day ever, he thought, helping his mom with the real work of the vineyard. Neither Maria nor Danny could have known that this beautiful October morning would be their last walk together through the peaceful rows of grapevines. Detective Robert Hayes had seen a lot of missing person cases in his 25 years with the county sheriff's department, but the disappearance of Maria and her son Danny haunted him like no other. It had been 6 months since that October morning when they vanished without a trace, and every lead had turned into a dead end. The case file sat on his desk, thick with witness statements, search reports, and photographs. Hayes opened it for what felt like the 100th time, hoping to find something he had missed. The vineyard supervisor Tom had been the first to report them missing when Maria didn't show up for work that morning. Her car was still parked outside, their cottage, keys hanging on the hook inside the door. Her purse was on the kitchen table with $43 inside. Nothing looked disturbed or out of place. The initial search had been massive. Over 200 volunteers combed through every inch of the vineyard and the surrounding hills. Helicopters flew overhead while search dogs tracked scents that seemed to disappear into thin air. The local fire department, park rangers, and volunteers from 3 counties all joined the effort. For 2 weeks, the vineyard was filled with people calling Maria's and Danny's names, hoping for any sign of where they might have gone. Hayes remembered the hope in the eyes of Maria's parents when they drove up from Los Angeles. Ana and Carlos. Rodriguez had raised Maria after immigrating from Mexico 30 years earlier. They were hardworking people who had saved every penny to give their daughter a better life. When Maria disappeared, they sold their small grocery store and used the money to hire private investigators and post reward notices throughout California. The private investigators found nothing new. They retraced every step of the official investigation, interviewed every person who had ever known Maria, and followed up on every tip that came in. For 3 years, Ana and Carlos spent their life savings chasing shadows and false leads. Phone calls from people claiming to have seen Maria and Danny in different states always led nowhere. As the years passed, the case grew colder. New missing person reports came in regularly, and Hayes had to divide his attention between fresh cases and old ones. But he never completely gave up on Maria and Danny. Every few months he would pull out their file and read through it again, hoping that time might help him see something differently. The vineyard owners, the Martinez family, struggled to keep their business running after the disappearance. Workers were afraid to take jobs there, and some of the regular customers stopped buying their wine. People whispered that the vineyard was cursed or haunted. On quiet mornings, several people claimed to see a woman and small boy walking between the grape rows, but when they looked closer, no one was there. By 2005, the vineyard was barely making enough money to pay its bills. James Martinez, who had inherited the property from his father, was considering selling. The beautiful rolling hills that had once been his family's pride and joy now reminded him daily of the tragedy that had happened there. His wife Linda supported whatever decision he wanted to make, but she knew how hard it would be for him to let go of 4 generations of family history. Hayes had been promoted to lead detective by then, but he still kept the Rodriguez case active in the computer system. New technology was constantly being developed, and he hoped that someday DNA testing or other scientific advances might help solve the mystery. In 2008, when the state crime lab started using more advanced testing methods, Hayes sent them evidence from Maria's cottage again, hoping for a breakthrough. The new tests didn't reveal anything useful. There were fingerprints from Maria, Danny, and Tom, the supervisor, exactly what Hayes expected to find. No signs of a struggle, no foreign DNA, no clues about what might have happened to them. It was as if they had simply walked out of their cottage that morning and vanished into thin air. Ana Rodriguez never stopped believing that her daughter and grandson were alive somewhere. Every year on Danny's birthday, she would place an advertisement in newspapers across California with their pictures and a plea for information. She kept the same phone number for over 20 years, just in case Maria tried to call home. Every ring of the telephone made her heart race, hoping it might be the call she had been waiting for. Carlos had a harder time staying hopeful. The stress of losing his daughter and grandson, combined with the financial strain of the search efforts, had taken a toll on his health. He developed heart problems and had to retire early from his job at a construction company. He spent his days sitting in their small apartment, staring at photographs of Maria and Danny, wondering what had happened to them. The story became part of local folklore in the wine country. Tour guides would sometimes point out the vineyard, where the mother and son had disappeared, and ghost hunters claimed the property was haunted. True crime podcasters and amateur investigators would occasionally contact Hayes, wanting to take a fresh look at the case, but none of them found anything new. Hayes attended several training seminars about cold cases over the years. He learned about new investigative techniques and technologies that might help solve old mysteries. Each time he came back from training, he would spend a few days working on the Rodriguez case again, applying what he had learned. But the case seemed immune to every approach he tried. In 2010, the state launched a new cold case initiative using the latest DNA technology to re-examine evidence from unsolved crimes. Hayes was excited to submit the Rodriguez case for review. For months, he waited for results that might finally provide answers. When the report came back, it confirmed what he already knew but provided nothing new. The DNA evidence was consistent, with Maria and Danny living in the cottage, but there was no indication of what had happened to them. By 2012, Hayes was 58 years old and thinking about retirement. He had solved hundreds of cases during his career, helped put dangerous criminals in prison, and brought closure to countless families. But the Rodriguez case remained his biggest regret. He felt like he had failed Maria, Danny, and their family by not being able to find answers. The vineyard was struggling more than ever. James Martinez had developed diabetes, and his doctor told him to reduce stress in his life. Linda Martinez spent sleepless nights worrying about their finances and their future. They had put their hearts and souls into keeping the family business alive. But the shadow of the disappearance seemed to hang over everything they did. That spring, James and Linda made the difficult decision to sell the vineyard. They hoped that new owners might have better luck, and that maybe the property could have a fresh start with different people. The real estate agent warned them that the property's history might affect its value, but they were ready to move on with their lives. Hayes heard about the sale through the local newspaper. He wondered if new owners might discover something that had been missed during all the searches and investigations. Sometimes fresh eyes could see things that others had overlooked. As he looked at the Rodriguez case file one more time, he hoped that someday, somehow, Maria and Danny would finally be found. The real estate agent's voice was carefully neutral as she drove up the winding road to the Vineyard. "Now, I do need to mention that this property has some history," she said, glancing at her clients in the rearview mirror. "There was an incident here about 30 years ago. A woman and her young son who worked here went missing. They were never found." David Kim nodded from the passenger seat while his wife Rachel leaned forward with interest. Their 16-year-old daughter Sophie looked up from her phone in the back seat. The family had been looking for Vineyard property for over a year, and this was the first one that fit both their budget and their dreams. David had built a successful software company in San Francisco, but the stress of city life and long work hours had taken a toll on his health. His doctor had suggested he find a way to reduce stress, and David had always dreamed of making wine. Rachel, who worked as a landscape architect, was excited about the possibility of designing beautiful gardens on Vineyard property. "What kind of incident exactly?" Rachel asked as they pulled into the driveway of the main house. The agent parked and turned around to face them. A mother and son who lived in one of the worker cottages simply disappeared one morning. The police searched everywhere but never found any trace of them. It was quite a mystery at the time. Sophie perked up immediately. She had always been fascinated by unsolved mysteries and true crime stories. "When did this happen? Were they murdered?" "Sophie," her mother warned gently, but the teenager was already intrigued. "It was in 1982, the agent continued. The police investigated thoroughly, but they never determined what happened. The case is still officially open." David and Rachel exchanged glances. They had fallen in love with the Vineyard from the photos online, and the price was surprisingly reasonable for such beautiful property. Now they understood why. The agent led them through the main house, which needed some updating but had good bones and spectacular views of the rolling hills. The Vineyard itself was in decent condition, though it would need significant work to bring it back to full production. Previous owners had let some areas go dormant during their financial struggles. "The missing woman worked here?" Rachel asked as they walked through the grape rows. "Yes, she was a seasonal worker during harvest time. She and her son lived in one of the cottages on the property. That cottage is still there, though it's been empty since the disappearance." Sophie was taking pictures with her phone and asking detailed questions about the case. The agent knew some basic facts but suggested they could research more if they were interested. The local library had newspaper archives, and some online forums discussed the case occasionally. After touring the property for 3 hours, David and Rachel were still interested despite the tragic history. The Vineyard had everything they wanted: good soil, excellent sun exposure, existing infrastructure, and enough space for Rachel to create extensive gardens. The price was within their budget, partly because of the property's reputation. That evening, back at their hotel, the family discussed the decision over dinner. Sophie had already started researching the disappearance on her laptop, finding old newspaper articles and police reports that had been digitized. "Look at this," Sophie said, turning her laptop toward her parents. "The woman's name was Maria Rodriguez and her son was Danny. He was only 8 years old. They just vanished on October 15, 1982. The police found their cottage completely, undisturbed, like they had just stepped out for a walk." Rachel studied the old photos of Maria and Danny. Maria looked young and happy in the pictures, with long dark hair and a warm smile. Danny was a cute kid with curious eyes and a gap-toothed grin. It was heartbreaking to think about what might have happened to them. "The property is beautiful," David said slowly, "and we could really make something special there. But I don't want to buy it if you two aren't comfortable with the history." Sophie was excited about the mystery aspect, but Rachel had mixed feelings. As a mother herself, she felt deeply sad about what had happened to Maria and Danny. At the same time, she believed that bringing new life and energy to the property might be a positive thing. "What if we bought it and tried to honor their memory somehow?" Rachel suggested. "I could design a memorial garden, maybe plant something beautiful where their cottage used to be." Over the next few days, they researched the property more thoroughly. They learned that the Vineyard had been in the Martinez family for 4 generations, before financial problems forced them to sell. James and Linda Martinez had moved to Arizona to be closer to their adult children, glad to finally put the tragedy behind them. David contacted Detective Hayes, who was still with the sheriff's department though nearing retirement. Hayes was professional, but clearly frustrated by the unsolved case. He assured David that the police had investigated thoroughly and found no evidence of ongoing danger on the property. Honestly, Hayes told David over the phone, I think about that case all the time. If you do buy the property, I'd appreciate it if you let me know if you find anything unusual. Sometimes new owners discover things that previous searches missed. Sophie spent hours reading about the case online. She found old interviews with search volunteers, articles about the investigation, and even some conspiracy theories about what might have happened. The more she read, the more invested she became in the mystery. Rachel began sketching ideas for landscaping the property. She envisioned terraced gardens on the hillsides, walking paths through the vineyards, and a peaceful memorial area where people could remember Maria and Danny. The existing landscape was beautiful but needed care and attention to reach its full potential. David researched the winemaking business, talking to other vineyard owners about the challenges and rewards. Several people mentioned the Rodriguez case when they learned which property he was considering. Some said the vineyard was cursed, but others thought new ownership might finally bring positive energy back to the land. After 2 weeks of consideration, the Kim family decided to make an offer. They felt that the property's beauty and potential outweighed its tragic history. Rachel was excited about her garden plans. David was ready to start learning about wine production, and Sophie was thrilled to be living somewhere with such an interesting mystery. The sale process took several months with inspections and paperwork typical of any real estate transaction. Rachel used the time to develop detailed plans for landscaping improvements. She wanted to create something beautiful that would attract visitors and help the vineyard succeed financially. One of Rachel's biggest plans was to terrace the hillside behind the main house. The slope was steep and had been prone to erosion, but terracing would create flat areas perfect for gardens and seating areas with views of the valley below. The project would require significant excavation, but the result would be stunning. Sophie continued researching the Rodriguez case, even starting a blog about unsolved mysteries where she wrote about Maria and Danny. She corresponded with other people interested in the case and organized all the information she had gathered into a comprehensive timeline. By late summer, the sale was complete, and the Kim family moved into their new home. The vineyard felt different with new life in it. Rachel immediately began planting flowers around the main house, while David started learning about grape cultivation from the few remaining vines that were still producing. The worker cottage where Maria and Danny had lived sat empty on the edge of the property. Rachel walked through it several times, imagining what their life had been like there. The cottage was small but comfortable, with a tiny kitchen and living room downstairs and 2 bedrooms upstairs. Someone had cleaned it out years ago, but Rachel could still picture a mother and son making it their home. As autumn approached, Rachel was ready to begin the major landscaping project. The terracing work would start in October, exactly 30 years after Maria and Danny had disappeared. None of them could have known that the excavation work would finally provide answers to the mystery that had haunted the vineyard for 3 decades. The morning of October 12th started like any other day of construction at the vineyard. Rachel had hired a local excavation company to begin the terracing project on the hillside behind the main house. The crew had been working for 2 weeks, moving tons of earth to create the level platforms where she planned to build her garden terraces. Miguel Santos, the crew foreman, had been doing excavation work in the valley for over 15 years. He knew the soil conditions and rock formations better than anyone in the area. That morning, his crew was working on the steepest section of the hillside, about 50 yards uphill from where Maria and Danny's cottage had been. Rachel was excited to see the progress. She had spent months planning this project and watching her vision take shape was incredibly satisfying. The terraced gardens would not only be beautiful, but would also prevent erosion and create usable space on the steep slope. Sophie was at school, but she had made Miguel promise to text her photos of anything interesting they found. Over the past 2 weeks, the excavation had turned up old bottles, rusted farm equipment, and even some Native American arrowheads. Sophie was fascinated by each discovery and had started a collection of artifacts from the property. David was in the vineyard checking on the grapevines when he heard Miguel shouting from the hillside. At first he thought someone might be hurt, but as he got closer he could tell the shouting wasn't panic. It was excitement mixed with confusion. "Mrs. Kim! Mrs. Kim, you need to see this!" Miguel called as Rachel came running from the house. When Rachel reached the excavation site, she found Miguel and his crew standing around a hole about 6 feet deep. They had been digging the foundation for a retaining wall when their excavator had broken through what appeared to be a concrete ceiling. "There's something down there," Miguel said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "It looks like a room or something. We need to be real careful from here." Rachel peered into the hole and could see what Miguel meant. The excavator had punched through a concrete slab revealing a dark space underneath. The opening was only about 2 feet wide, but she could see that there was definitely an empty space below the ground. David arrived just as Rachel was calling the sheriff's department. Something about the hidden room felt wrong to all of them. In 30 years of construction work, Miguel had never found anything like it. Underground rooms weren't common in this area, and the concrete ceiling suggested it had been built deliberately. Within an hour, Deputy Johnson arrived at the vineyard. He was a young officer who had heard about the Rodriguez case but hadn't been born when it happened. When he saw the hole in the ground, he immediately called for backup and asked his supervisor to contact Detective Hayes. Hayes arrived 40 minutes later, his heart pounding as he drove up to the vineyard. In all his years of investigating Maria and Danny's disappearance, he had never imagined they might find something like this. The timing seemed too coincidental to ignore. The detective carefully examined the excavation site while Rachel, David, and the construction crew waited anxiously. Nearby, the concrete ceiling was about 4 inches thick and appeared to have been poured professionally. This wasn't some amateur construction project. "We need to expand this opening carefully," Hayes told Miguel. "But we can't use heavy equipment anymore. We'll have to do it by hand." While they waited for additional officers and equipment to arrive, Hayes questioned Miguel about exactly what had happened. The crew had been digging in the same area for several days without finding anything unusual. The concrete ceiling had been about 5 feet underground, hidden by decades of soil erosion and plant growth. Sophie arrived home from school just as the crime scene investigators were setting up their equipment. She couldn't believe that something related to the mystery she had been researching might have been found right in her backyard. "Can I watch?" she asked her parents, who were standing with several police officers near the excavation site. Detective Hayes looked at the teenage girl with interest. He had heard from her parents that she had been researching the Rodriguez case. "You're the one who's been studying this case, right? What do you think about all this?" Sophie looked into the hole with excitement and fear. "I think Maria and Danny might be down there," she said quietly. "Someone built this hiding place for a reason." As the afternoon went on, investigators carefully expanded the opening in the concrete ceiling. Using hand tools and lights, they slowly revealed more of the underground space. It appeared to be a rectangular room, roughly 8 feet by 12 feet with concrete walls and floor. When the opening was finally large enough, Detective Hayes was the first person to descend into the hidden room. He wore full protective gear and carried powerful flashlights as he carefully climbed down a ladder that investigators had lowered through the hole. What he found in that underground room would haunt him for the rest of his life. "We've got them," he radioed to the officers. Above ground, his voice tight with emotion. "Call the coroner. We found Maria and Danny Rodriguez." The hidden room contained the remains of a woman and a young boy, along with personal items that immediately identified them. Maria's distinctive turquoise bracelet, which her mother had described to police 30 years earlier, was still on her wrist. Danny's small backpack with his name written in permanent marker sat in one corner of the room. Rachel broke down crying when she heard the news. For months, she had been planning beautiful gardens for this hillside, never knowing that Maria and Danny were buried just feet away from where she wanted to plant flowers. The discovery sent shockwaves through the local community. Within hours, news vans were parked outside the vineyard gates and reporters were calling everyone connected to the case. Ana Rodriguez, now 78 years old, collapsed when Detective Hayes called to tell her that her daughter and grandson had finally been found. As investigators processed the scene, they found evidence that the underground room had been constructed specifically to hide bodies. The concrete work was professional quality, and the room had been designed to be completely sealed from the outside. Whoever built it had planned this carefully. The breakthrough came when crime scene technicians found DNA evidence on some construction materials in the room. Advanced testing techniques that hadn't existed in 1982 were now able to extract genetic material from tiny samples. The DNA belonged to someone who wasn't Maria or Danny, which meant they finally had a suspect. Detective Hayes spent that night going through every file related to the Rodriguez case, looking for anyone who might match the DNA profile. The answer, when it came, was more shocking than anyone had expected. The DNA belonged to Frank Wilson, a man who had been a silent business partner in the Vineyard operation back in 1982. Wilson had provided financing for the Martinez family's wine business, but he had kept his involvement secret from most people. Very few people even knew he existed. Hayes remembered seeing Wilson's name mentioned briefly in the original case files, but he had never been considered a serious suspect. Wilson had claimed he was traveling in Europe when Maria and Danny disappeared, and no one had thought to verify his alibi thoroughly. Now, 30 years later, investigators learned that Wilson had been using the Vineyard to hide illegal financial activities. Maria had accidentally discovered evidence of his crimes, and Wilson had killed both her and Danny to protect his secret. The hidden room had been his way of making them disappear forever. The case that had haunted Detective Hayes for 30 years was finally solved, but the victory felt hollow. Maria and Danny were gone, and no amount of justice could bring them back to the family that had never stopped loving them. The manhunt for Frank Wilson began immediately after investigators confirmed his DNA at the crime scene. Detective Hayes worked around the clock, coordinating with law enforcement agencies across the country to track down the man who had evaded justice for 30 years. Wilson was now 71 years old and living under a false name in a retirement community outside Phoenix, Arizona. He had been collecting Social Security benefits and living quietly as Robert Thompson, a supposed retired accountant with no criminal history. His neighbors knew him as a friendly older man who played cards every Tuesday and volunteered at the local food bank. When FBI agents knocked on his door at 6 a.m, Wilson's face went completely white. He had been living with the secret for 3 decades, probably thinking he would never be caught. Modern DNA technology had finally reached back through time to expose his terrible crime. Frank Wilson, you're under arrest for the murders of Maria Rodriguez and Daniel Rodriguez, Agent Martinez announced as they placed handcuffs on the elderly man. Wilson's hands were shaking as they led him to the police car. Neighbors came out of their houses, shocked to see their quiet friend being arrested. None of them could believe that the man they knew as Bob Thompson was actually a killer who had been hiding from justice for 30 years. Back in California, the news of Wilson's arrest spread quickly through the wine country. Detective Hayes held a press conference that afternoon, his voice thick with emotion as he announced that the Rodriguez case had finally been solved. After 30 years of investigation, we have arrested the man responsible for the deaths of Maria Rodriguez and her 8-year-old son, Danny, Hayes said to the crowd of reporters. This case has haunted our department and this community for 3 decades. Today we can finally say that justice will be served. Anna Rodriguez was watching the press conference from her small apartment in Los Angeles. At 78, she had never given up hope that someday she would learn what happened to her daughter and grandson. When she heard that their killer had been arrested, she cried tears of both relief and sorrow. I always knew someone had hurt them, she told reporters later. Maria would never have just disappeared. She loved Danny too much to put him in danger. Someone took them away from us, and now we finally know who. The Kim family found themselves at the center of a media storm. News crews camped outside their vineyard, wanting to interview the family who had accidentally solved one of the region's most famous cold cases. Rachel, David, and Sophie tried to stay focused on honoring Maria and Danny's memory, rather than seeking attention for themselves. Sophie, now 17, had become something of an expert on the case through her research. several true crime podcasts, invited her to tell the story of how her family had discovered the hidden room. She was careful to focus on Maria and Danny as real people, not just victims in a mystery story. They weren't just names in a case file, Sophie said during one interview. Maria was a young mother trying to build a good life for her son. Danny was just a little boy who loved living at the Vineyard. They deserved so much better than what happened to them. Frank Wilson's trial began 8 months after his arrest. The prosecution had overwhelming evidence, including his DNA at the crime scene and financial records showing his illegal activities at the Vineyard in 1982. Wilson's defense attorney tried to argue that the DNA evidence could have been contaminated after 30 years, but forensic experts testified that the samples were reliable. During the trial, investigators revealed the full scope of Wilson's crimes. He had been using the Vineyard as a front for money laundering operations, hiding cash from illegal gambling and drug activities. Maria had discovered financial documents that didn't match the Vineyard's legitimate business, and she had started asking questions that made Wilson nervous. The prosecution showed that Wilson had panicked when Maria threatened to report what she had found to the police. On the morning of October 15, 1982, he had lured Maria and Danny to a remote part of the Vineyard, killed them both, and then hidden their bodies in the underground room he had secretly constructed months earlier. Frank Wilson is a cold-blooded killer who murdered an innocent woman and child to protect his criminal enterprises, the prosecutor told the jury. For 30 years he has lived free while the Rodriguez family suffered, not knowing what happened to their loved ones. Wilson's trial lasted 6 weeks and received national media attention. The case had everything that fascinated the public. A decades-old mystery, a shocking discovery, and justice finally served. Court TV broadcast the proceedings live, and social media was filled with discussions about the case. Ana Rodriguez attended every day of the trial, sitting in the front row and staring directly at the man who had killed her daughter and grandson. She was now using a walker and needed help getting around, but nothing could keep her away from seeing Wilson face justice. "I wanted him to see my face every day," she said later. "I wanted him to remember that Maria had a family who loved her, and that we never stopped looking for the truth." The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before finding Wilson guilty on all charges. When the verdict was read, Ana Rodriguez collapsed in tears of relief. Detective Hayes, who had testified extensively during the trial, felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he had been carrying for 3 decades. Wilson was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. At 71 years old, he would spend whatever time he had left behind bars, finally paying for the crimes he had committed so long ago. After the trial ended, the Kim family held a memorial service for Maria and Danny at the Vineyard. They invited anyone who wanted to come pay their respects, and over 300 people attended. Former Vineyard workers, police officers who had worked on the case, and complete strangers who had followed the story, all came to honor the memory of the mother and son. Rachel had designed a beautiful memorial garden at the spot where Maria and Danny were found. She planted roses and lavender, flowers that would bloom every year and fill the air with sweet fragrance. A simple stone marker bore their names and the inscription, "Maria and Danny Rodriguez, beloved daughter, mother, and son, finally at rest." Detective Hayes retired 6 months after Wilson's conviction. He had solved hundreds of cases during his career, but bringing justice for Maria and Danny felt like his greatest accomplishment. At his retirement party, he thanked the Kim family for never giving up and for treating the discovery with the respect and dignity that Maria and Danny deserved. The Vineyard began producing wine again under the Kim family's management. Rachel's terraced gardens became a popular destination for visitors, and the memorial area provided a peaceful place for people to remember Maria and Danny. Instead of being known as the site of an unsolved mystery, the Vineyard became a symbol of how truth and justice can prevail even after decades. Sophie went on to study criminal justice in college, inspired by her family's role in solving the Rodriguez case. She continued to write about unsolved mysteries, always focusing on the human stories behind the crimes and the families who never stopped searching for answers. Ana Rodriguez lived to be 82, spending her final years knowing that her daughter and grandson had finally received justice. She visited their memorial garden several times, finding peace in the beautiful spot where they could rest undisturbed. The case became a reminder that some secrets can't stay buried forever, and that families who refuse to give up hope can sometimes find the answers they've been seeking for decades. Maria and Danny Rodriguez were finally home.